It was a gruesome murder, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. There was an 8.5-inch gash across her head. You have strangulation with a garrote made out of a paint stick. Now, this paint, for the last, about a month ago, I learned that the paint stick that was broken in half and they made paintbrush stick was in fact one of Patsy Ramsey's paintbrushes. And she also, one of the things that's in this story is that there's odd touches. She's found in this basement storage room, but found with her is her very, very favorite possession in the world, according to one of her relatives, her pageant nightgown. It's, snuggled up with her.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, this is essentially part 3 in the Ramsey Housekeeper story. Now, she was trying to write a book about it, but she certainly got to the point really very, very quickly. And so when she shares her theory of what happened, this is what she writes. And we're going to deal with Linda Hoffman's 5 very disturbing observations. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So she starts by saying, so let me tell you how I believe JonBenet was murdered. Number 1, Patsy was exhausted. Now this paints a totally different portrait from the sort of mostly evidentiary portrait we've seen. We get a sense of Patsy through the housekeeper as a person. We get a sense of Patsy through the housekeeper of the dynamics linking Patsy to the rest of her family and in a sense how they would have experienced their mother, this lady, John's wife. And whatever the housekeeper's motive in writing this book, a lot of it does make sense. Remember, December was a jam-packed month for Patsy and John. Patsy had an early 40th birthday party celebration. John was also celebrating a bonanza business year at Access Graphics. Another aspect that's not often spoken about is John's birthday, which was the 7th of December. So there was quite a lot of celebrating taking place and parties in the December of 1996. And we get a real authentic sense of the run-up to Christmas from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. In 1996, Priscilla White called and asked me to watch the kids again. They were having a surprise birthday party for Patsy. I hid out in a car down the block until Patsy's friends picked her up. By then, JonBenet had changed a lot. She was taller and thinner and her hair was colored. I didn't know about her pageants until that night when I saw all her trophies. Then Patsy called me on December 1st, the night of the Access Graphics Christmas party. She wanted me to sit with JonBenet and Burke. Patsy told me to make sure JonBenet kept her hair in rollers overnight. She had a pageant the next day. Now tell me, what kid wants to sleep in rollers? While we were watching TV in her parents' room, JonBenet put one of her crowns on my head. Now, this is also quite an interesting analogy to the idea, would JonBenet, if she had rollers in her hair overnight, I mean, there was a purpose to that, would she have pigtails and a ribbon in her hair if her mother really cared about, the beauty pageant side of things? Then there's also another reference from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. One final note, this is from Patsy. Thank you to all my friends and my dear husband for surprising me with the biggest, most outrageous 40th birthday party bash I've ever had, ! We'll be spending my actual birthday on the Disney Big Red Boat over the new year. And so you get a sense that there was a frenetic amount of activity, parties, preparations, outrageous birthday bashes, and so on, not just for Patsy, but likely for John as well. And so when the housekeeper claims that Patsy was tired by, the 23rd, 24th, 25th, she may have a point. She writes the following: if I was speaking to Patsy Ramsey right now, this is what I would say to her. You were spent and exhausted, weren't you? That's kind of the first thing she thinks about. She feels if she confronted Patsy right now, the first thing she would say is, you were really tired, weren't you? The holidays do that to people. Now remember, Patsy also went to New York on a shopping spree, I believe, with the Steins, and immediately after that prepared JonBenet for her next pageant. So I think the pageants were another thing that were exhausting Patsy and perhaps JonBenet as well. You have all of this activity, and then when you're home, when you have a chance to rest, there's all of this prep, all of this work, all of this scrubbing and rehearsing and getting ready for these pageants. That must have sucked up a lot of energy. Number 2, Patsy was even more exhausted on Christmas Day. Now, is it just me, or does Patsy look particularly tired in this last photo of Patsy with JonBenet? Now, one thing even Patsy didn't anticipate was the housekeeper not turning up the day after the Christmas party on the 23rd. She was supposed to. And I think this shows just to what extent Patsy did feel as tired as a snail crawling uphill, as tired as a ship without wind. You know, that she felt like a book with every page turned. According to the housekeeper and how she was quoted in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Linda Hoffman said, "I was supposed to come back the next day," that's to the Ramsey home, December 24th, that's after the Christmas party, and clean up. That was what she was supposed to do. I called Patsy and said I couldn't. I told her I had a fight with my sister and needed some money to pay the rent. And one does wonder whether that little bit of information, I needed money to pay my rent, didn't figure into whoever wrote the ransom note. Because literally the day before this incident, the housekeeper asked Patsy for a $2,000 loan. So you can see that Patsy just didn't have it in herself to clean up those gingerbread houses. And if she felt this worn out at home, how did she deal with 2 rambunctious kids? We can also see how this weariness is aggravated by the bedwetting, how Patsy simply felt, or probably felt, that it was just another issue that was too much to deal with. Number 3, Patsy was out of sorts on the 23rd. Now, we are going back slightly, but I think it is interesting that as late as the 23rd of December, we get a description. Remember, it's the last time that the housekeeper saw Patsy directly, face to face. And this was her impression. Patsy was out of sorts. Patsy wasn't in a good place. Patsy wasn't in a good mood. Patsy was already drained, tired, perhaps even a little irritable, and who could blame her? Something mysterious did seem to happen on the 23rd, which apparently prompted a 911 call. Anyway, the housekeeper writes, "At the party on December 23rd, you appeared a little out of sorts, perhaps because there were 20 people in the house, with another 20 on the way. It was 5 in the afternoon, and I was on my way out the door, leaving you without help." The fact that the housekeeper not only left early, but left Patsy in the lurch the next day as well, likely made Patsy feel even more tired, perhaps helpless and depressed. One does get a sense that Patsy was a beauty queen who was used to having her cake and eating it, used to perhaps having other people do things for her. And prepping the house for Christmas that year, you can see it was a big undertaking, and one that left Patsy feeling extremely worn out. Number 4, did the housekeeper know something about Patsy that we don't? And this is a really interesting addition to the narrative. She writes, "So it's okay if you dip deeply into the Beringer Chardonnay, your favorite wine, that you kept in the walk-in refrigerator just off the kitchen." So this is a bit of shade that the housekeeper is casting. It's a bit of a swipe at Patsy, but one does wonder if there's some truth to it, whether the housekeeper had observed Patsy drinking the wine. I mean, how did she know it was her favorite wine? It's another interesting dimension if it's true, and of course, we can only know if the CSIs photographed the bottle and measured its contents. Were there any fingerprints on them as well? Of course, if Patsy was drowning her sorrows, this elevates the neglect narrative in a way that I think, well, certainly I can't help feeling a large measure of compassion for Patsy. How about you? Number 5, Patsy was depressed. Sometimes Christmases can be depressing. There's a lot of fun until it starts to get a bit much, doesn't it? And so the housekeeper writes, "Holidays can be depressing. I don't blame you for being down. Your big 40 birthday was less than a week away, and you had dealt with ovarian cancer for years, and your beauty queen looks were fading. Miss West Virginia of 1977 had become a middle-aged matron. You loved JonBenet, but she was a handful wetting the bed night after night. She was driving you crazy. Now, Patsy does like to put a show on, and sometimes behind that show are things that are really not really very attractive at all. So on the one hand, you have JONBENET, who wins these pageants. On the other hand, you have this child who can't sleep and who wets her bed every night, and the smell of urine in her bedroom almost every morning. That's the other side of the JONBENET story. And is there another side to Patsy? Is there another side to John? Is there another side to Burke? And so it's not every day that we think of JONBENET, this cute little girl, being a handful, rather than this one-dimensional version of her just as an innocent victim and nothing more. And was JONBENET a handful to anyone else? Was anyone else in that family a handful as well? The housekeeper goes on to say, Christmas Day wasn't quiet or peaceful either. There was pressure, lots of pressure, and I wasn't there to smooth out the rough edges for you. Sure, it was a picture-perfect snow on the ground, and your home was a decorator's dream. Isn't it interesting that even the housekeeper remembers there was snow on the ground that Christmas? I mean, she visited Boulder the day before, and she lived in the area as well. She goes on to write, I remember helping to decorate the artificial Christmas trees, one for nearly every room in the house. That is a lot of work. And also, taking a bicycle to the neighbor just shows you a lot of work went into this. Giant candy canes bordered both sides of the walk. But there were homes to visit, open houses that had to be dropped in and dropped out of. And you were expected to gather up Burke and JONBENET and have them ready to fly out at daybreak to Michigan, where there was going to be a second Christmas at your lakefront vacation house. John would hire the pilot, but you were the one who had to pack and organize and get the kids dressed. Now imagine the amount of work, not only preparing one perfect Christmas, for Patsy's own children, but another for John's kids as well. The housekeeper goes on to say, so you were weary that night. Who wouldn't be? John was no help. He did what he always did, swallowed a couple of melatonin capsules and fell into a deep sleep. He wouldn't have heard a cannon go off if it was next to the bed. Now, I don't know if I agree with the housekeeper's assessment in terms of this. One has to wonder who read Mindhunter and who decided to dip into it that night, if anyone did. And if anyone did, who was most likely to do so? Because it does seem as though someone had a kind of a microscopic knowledge of the crime, thinking of it as a crime scene. That there might be fingerprints, traces, a psychological profile left by the ransom note writer. All of this had to be delicately done away with or disguised. It is also interesting to note the housekeeper's almost sneering dislike for John, saying John was no help. He did what he always did, etc. Her impression appears to be that if Patsy did very little around the house, John did virtually nothing. Well, I guess as a sort of businessman running a billion-dollar empire, he perhaps earned the right to that, but it certainly does expose the housekeeper's attitude to John. She also writes, you were still wearing the red sweater and black velvet trousers when you put JONBENET to bed Christmas night. Surprisingly, for someone who has 100 dresses and prides herself with never wearing the same outfit twice. Now, this is also, I think, a very interesting insight, potentially from the housekeeper. You do get certain people that are like that. I'm not going to wear an outfit or not be seen wearing the same outfit twice. And then she said, you were wearing that same costume when the police arrived the next day. So obviously the housekeeper sees this as significant. Is she right? Now, I've made the same observation, that there doesn't seem to be an innocent reason why Patsy, of all people, Patsy, who's this flashy, showy, and all about appearances, would fly out on the day after Christmas wearing the clothes she'd worn the previous day. What are John's kids going to think of her? What is John even going to think of her? Now, through the course of writing books and covering this case, many people have told me they do this all the time, and it's absolutely normal. Maybe it's normal for you. Maybe it's also normal for me. But if you think Patsy would do this after 28 years, you still don't have a clue about the type of woman Patsy really was. in my opinion, and I think in the housekeeper's opinion as well. You don't know the kind of person you're dealing with here. She wouldn't do that. In any event, this is the housekeeper's version of what she thinks happened. It's almost, as far as I'm concerned, as silly as Kolar's stolen pineapple theory. She says, JonBenet wet the bed again that night, didn't she? She woke up and told you about it before you were even undressed, and you simply lost it. You took her into the bathroom. Now, that's another thing that I'm not sure is accurate, that JonBenet would have woken up and told her mother. I kind of got the impression that they simply changed clothing and then went to another bed. Perhaps if it happened early in the night, maybe. Now, this part, if true, is quite disturbing. It was the same destination you always took JonBenet when it was time to punish her for bedwetting. You forget that I saw you take her there so many times before, meaning you forget that, Patsy, I saw you take JonBenet into her bathroom many times before, shutting the door tightly behind you so her screams could not be heard. It's quite worrying if this is true. Except this time there was an accident, wasn't there? You picked up the long black flashlight you had brought with you and you swung it. Now, this also doesn't really make sense. Why would Patsy take a flashlight into JonBenet's bathroom? You swung it first at her crotch and then next at her head. Maybe you meant to scare her, and maybe you didn't mean to kill her, but you did. Now, that to me is also not particularly convincing. I don't think the kind of sexual interference was as crude as the housekeeper has it, but I guess she's got to try and reconcile her theory with the evidence. Now, despite everything, not even the housekeeper believed that Patsy deliberately murdered her child. There are some who do believe this, and I think this reveals, if you do, this reveals your depravity and your lack of understanding of this case, not Patsy's. Anyway, the housekeeper goes on to say, at first you thought you had knocked her out, but then she wasn't breathing, and you felt for a pulse, but there was none. Now, this is also probably not accurate, because JonBenet very likely would have been alive for some time even after suffering that blow to the head. It was a concussive blow, but it wouldn't have killed her instantly. And some even say that it was possibly even survivable. So I do think that element may have been true in the ground zero of this case, that she could have been knocked out by this blow, and someone may have found her, didn't want her to be dead, didn't intend to kill her, but then were dealt with the situation. JonBenet is not conscious now. How do we bring her back, in a way? And so the part that's missing from this story is the pineapple, the scream. And that, I mean, if there was a scream, wouldn't that have woken up John or Burke as well? And I mean, this is something that supposedly happened in JonBenet's bathroom. So the scream definitely would have alerted other people in the house if it was in that sort of central part of the house. Does that make sense? And also, as far as I know, Patsy wasn't a Girl Scout who could tie knots. Anyway, I'm not going to take it further than that. If you've listened this far, thank you for concentrating. Thanks for staying with it. And I'll see you guys next time.